Occupied France, late May 1944. A faint, persistent hiss began to insinuate itself into the German tactical radio nets across the Western Front, an unwelcome guest in the tightly controlled airwaves. This subtle intrusion, initially dismissed as atmospheric interference, carried with it the silent threat of operational paralysis, undermining the very nervous system of the Wehrmacht as the Allied invasion loomed. Communication, the lifeblood of coordinated defense, now faced an unseen assailant. Oberfunkmeister Klaus Richter, a veteran radio operator with the 716th Infantry Division near Caen, first noted the peculiar quality of the static just after 0300 hours on May 24th. Unlike the familiar crackle of distant thunderstorms or the transient pops of local electrical discharge, this new sound possessed an unnerving regularity, a low-frequency hum underlying the higher-pitched white noise. Is Telefunken Fug 10, a robust medium-range transceiver, usually offered crystal-clear reception within its 100-kilometer operational radius. But now, even local transmissions from battalion headquarters were occasionally marred. Richter, with his 6 years of field experience, had developed an almost preternatural sensitivity to the nuances of radio signals. He had seen equipment fail, antennas damaged, and atmospheric conditions shift dramatically. But this was different. The static seemed to cling to certain frequencies, particularly those allocated for interdivisional communication, yet it would occasionally drift, a phantom presence on the band. He logged the anomaly, noting its persistence and the slight degradation in signal-to-noise ratio, but ascribed it to an unusual weather pattern moving in from the Atlantic. The Telefunken Fug 10, a mainstay of German divisional communications, was a marvel of engineering for its time, employing a superheterodyne receiver circuit with a tunable frequency range of 3 to 6.6 MHz for voice and Morse code. Its power output of 20 watts typically ensured reliable contact, even through moderate interference. Yet, this new static seemed to bypass the receiver's robust filtering capabilities, embedding itself directly into the audio output, a ghost in the machine. Across the front, from the Dutch coast to the Bay of Biscay, similar observations were being logged in the communication sections of various units. The initial reports were isolated, fragmented, and often contradictory in their assessment of the phenomenon's origin. Some attributed it to faulty equipment, others to inexperienced operators, and a significant number to the cyclical nature of sunspot activity, a well-understood source of radio disruption. The sheer scale of the affected area, however, began to suggest something more systemic. The German High Command, reliant on a rigid hierarchical communication structure, placed immense value on the integrity of its radio links. Each message, from reconnaissance reports to artillery fire orders, flowed through these channels. The prospect of these vital arteries being compromised, even subtly, was a strategic vulnerability of the highest order, though at this early stage, the true nature of the threat remained obscured by a veil of technical supposition and operational inertia. The static was merely an inconvenience, a background hum in the grand symphony of war. The anomaly persisted, a localized and persistent interference pattern that defied conventional explanation. German radio technicians, accustomed to the vagaries of atmospheric conditions and the occasional errant signal, logged the disturbances with increasing frequency. Their initial reports, filed through the established channels of the Funküberwachungsdienst, described a broadband noise floor rising inexplicably in specific sectors, often coinciding with periods of heightened Allied air activity or troop movements. This was not the static crackle of distant thunderstorms, nor the familiar hum of industrial machinery. The interference exhibited a distinct artificial signature. Spectrum analyzers, bulky and temperamental, revealed a spread of energy across multiple frequencies, a deliberate wash rather than a discrete, targeted beam. The power output, though not overwhelming, was sufficient to degrade clarity, turning crisp voice communications into garbled whispers and rendering Morse code unintelligible beyond short distances. Interrogation files from captured British and American prisoners of war, though often yielding little tactical intelligence, occasionally contained oblique references to new electronic countermeasures. Production logs from Telefunken and Lorenz, the primary suppliers of German radio equipment, showed no corresponding increase in component failures or design flaws that could account for such a widespread and consistent degradation of signal quality. The equipment itself, from the compact Torn EB receivers to the powerful 100 WS transmitters, was robust, built to withstand the rigors of combat. The strategic implication of this persistent interference remained largely unacknowledged at higher echelons. Field reports detailing communication difficulties were often dismissed as operator error or localized equipment malfunctions. The prevailing doctrine emphasized the resilience of German command and control, a belief that their established protocols and technical superiority would overcome any enemy attempt at disruption. The Oberkommando der Wehrmacht maintained a steadfast confidence in its communications infrastructure, viewing electronic warfare as a peripheral concern rather than a fundamental threat to operational integrity. This quiet, creeping erosion of communication clarity, however, began to manifest in subtle but tangible ways. Orders arrived late or garbled. Reconnaissance reports, vital for anticipating enemy movements, lost their immediacy. The intricate dance of coordinated maneuvers, dependent on precise and timely information, began to falter. A nascent dissonance within the carefully orchestrated symphony of the German war machine. The Allied Signals Intelligence Units, specifically the War Department's Signal Security Agency and its British counterpart, Government Code and Cipher School at Bletchley Park, had been meticulously compiling a comprehensive catalogue of German radio practices for years. This effort, often unseen, involved a vast network of intercept stations stretching from the Shetland Islands to the Middle East, each equipped with highly sensitive receivers and an array of directional antennas. They were not merely listening, they were dissecting the very fabric of German radio communication. Operators at these stations, many of them women with exceptional auditory perception and linguistic skills, logged every transmission, noting its frequency, modulation, and call signs. They identified the distinctive fist or sending style of individual Morse operators, a unique signature as personal as a written script. This allowed them to track specific units and even individual radio operators across the European theater, providing an unprecedented level of battlefield awareness. The German Army's radio doctrine, codified in manuals like the Vorschrift HDV 427, emphasized strict adherence to assigned frequencies and established communication protocols. This rigidity, while intended to ensure order and efficiency within their own networks, inadvertently created predictable patterns for Allied interceptors. They learned to anticipate when and where certain types of transmissions would occur, from daily weather reports to divisional command traffic. The equipment used for these intercepts varied, but the core was often a high-frequency receiver, such as the HRO or the AR-88, capable of tuning across broad spectrums with fine precision. These receivers, paired with oscilloscopes and frequency counters, allowed technicians to analyze the exact characteristics of a German signal, down to its precise bandwidth and power output. This detailed technical analysis was crucial for understanding the potential vulnerabilities of the German radio infrastructure. Analysis of these intercepted signals revealed the primary frequencies used by German field units, typically in the 1.5 to 12 MHz range for tactical communications, with higher frequencies reserved for longer-range links. The patterns of frequency hopping, or lack thereof, were meticulously charted. Most German tactical radios, like the Torn Fu B1, operated on fixed frequencies or had limited manual frequency selection, making them susceptible to targeted interference once their operational parameters were known. The intelligence gathered from these intercepts was not merely passive observation, it was a dynamic, evolving database that mapped the entire German radio landscape. Each new transmission added another data point, refining the understanding of their communication architecture. This granular detail allowed Allied planners to move beyond general awareness and towards precise, surgical intervention, understanding not just that the Germans were communicating, but how and where. The sheer volume of intercepted traffic was immense, requiring sophisticated cataloging and cross-referencing systems. Bletchley Park alone processed millions of messages, correlating them with other intelligence sources, including aerial reconnaissance and prisoner interrogations. This fusion of intelligence streams painted a remarkably complete picture of German dispositions and intentions, highlighting the critical role radio communications played in their operational command and control. This comprehensive understanding of German radio practices, from the technical specifications of their equipment to the operational habits of their operators, formed the bedrock of the Allied jamming strategy. It transformed jamming from a blunt instrument into a finely tuned weapon. Recommendation: exploit identified frequency stability and predictable operational schedules for maximum disruption. England, Spring 1944. The Allied response to the German communications network was not merely reactive. It was a calculated escalation, a deliberate application of technological superiority. Intelligence gathered from captured equipment and decrypted transmissions had provided a precise blueprint of German radio frequencies and modulation schemes, particularly those utilized by the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe ground-to-air and divisional networks. This detailed understanding allowed Allied engineers to design countermeasures with surgical precision. The heart of this countermeasure was a new generation of high-powered jamming transmitters, designated carpet and mandrel, for their respective operational roles. Carpet jammers, developed by the Telecommunications Research Establishment, were specifically tuned to disrupt the German Würzburg and Freya radar bands, operating primarily in the 500 to 600 MHz range. Mandrel, on the other hand, focused on broader, lower-frequency bands, saturating the airwaves used for voice and Morse code communication between German ground units and their supporting air assets. These devices were not simply noise generators. They employed sophisticated modulation techniques. Instead of a single, continuous tone, they emitted a complex, rapidly shifting array of frequencies and amplitude variations designed to mimic and then overwhelm the target signal. A typical carpet jammer, like the AN-APT-2, could output 500 watts of broadband noise, effectively raising the noise floor across multiple German channels simultaneously. Production logs from General Electric and Westinghouse indicate that by May 1944, over 300 such units were ready for deployment, a scale of electronic warfare previously unseen. The strategic implication was profound. The intent was not merely to inconvenience German operators, but to render their command and control infrastructure functionally deaf. If a German unit could not reliably transmit or receive orders, intelligence, or tactical updates, its operational effectiveness would plummet, regardless of its physical strength. The ideological underpinning was a belief that disruption, when applied systematically, could be as destructive as direct ordnance. The deployment began subtly, with individual jamming stations operating from secure sites in southern England, initially targeting specific sectors of the French coast. Intercept reports from the German 7th Army's Signals Intelligence Unit, dated early May 1944, frequently noted unusual atmospheric interference and sporadic signal degradation on their standard communication channels. These initial reports, however, were often attributed to natural phenomena or localized equipment faults, filtering up the command chain as minor technical annoyances rather than a coordinated assault. Occupied France, August 1943. The static, at first, was a nuisance, a low hum that occasionally obscured a word or two on the shortwave bands. For the German Nachrichtenhelferinnen and their male counterparts manning the wireless sets across the Atlantic Wall, it was an irritant, a familiar, if unwelcome guest in the ether that connected their dispersed units. This was not the crisp, clear reception they had come to expect from their Telefunken and Lorenz receivers, but a subtle degradation, a persistent whisper that grew in intensity. The initial reports, filtering up the chain of command, from the company-level radio operators to the regimental communications officers, described intermittent interference. These were often logged as atmospheric disturbances or equipment malfunctions. Common enough occurrences in the demanding environment of wartime communications, the Wehrmacht had invested heavily in robust radio technology, and the operators were rigorously trained to distinguish between natural phenomena and deliberate interference. The early jamming signals, originating from Allied ground stations and airborne platforms, were relatively unsophisticated. They employed broad-spectrum noise, designed to overwhelm rather than precisely target specific frequencies. This brute force approach, while effective in creating general disruption, lacked the surgical precision that would later characterize Allied electronic warfare. The German analytical teams, primarily focused on intercepting and deciphering enemy transmissions, initially categorized these signals as low-priority background noise. The German High Command, preoccupied with the strategic realities of the Eastern Front and the burgeoning Allied air offensive, viewed these reports with a degree of skepticism. Propaganda was a weapon wielded by all sides, and the notion that the Allies would expend significant resources on what appeared to be mere technical harassment seemed, to some, a diversionary tactic. Interrogation files from captured German radio technicians later revealed a common sentiment: they are trying to demoralize us. The Führungsnachrichtenabteilung, responsible for all strategic communications, received summaries that downplayed the impact. Their analysis, based on the limited scope of the early jamming, concluded that it was not a systemic threat to their secure communications network. The established protocols for signal security, including frequency hopping and encryption, were deemed sufficient to counter such rudimentary attempts at disruption. The volume of intercepted Allied communications, still flowing relatively unimpeded, reinforced this assessment. The Nachrichtenoffiziere at division level, while noting the increasing frequency of interference, often attributed it to the growing complexity of the electromagnetic spectrum over Western Europe. The sheer number of Allied aircraft, each with its own radio equipment, contributed to a general increase in background noise. It was a chaotic environment, and the jamming was seen as just another variable in an already crowded airwave. The General der Nachrichtenaufklärung, the head of signals intelligence, reviewed the technical specifications of the jamming signals. The power output, as estimated from signal strength measurements, was not overwhelming. The frequencies used were often within the common military bands, making them easily detectable but not necessarily indicative of a sophisticated, targeted attack. The lack of precise targeting suggested a more generalized effort, one that could be mitigated through standard operational procedures. The belief that the jamming was merely a psychological operation designed to sow doubt and confusion gained traction within certain circles of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. The Allied propaganda machine was well known for its attempts to undermine German morale, and this electronic static was seen as an extension of that effort. The strategic implication was that acknowledging the jamming as a serious threat would lend credence to the Allied narrative of technological superiority. The German response, therefore, was largely reactive and tactical. Operators were instructed to shift frequencies more frequently, to increase power output where possible, and to rely more heavily on secure landlines for critical communications. These measures, while effective in isolated instances, failed to address the underlying escalating problem. The silence, when it finally came, would be absolute. The static, once a persistent irritant, began to coalesce into a wall of sound. Operators, accustomed to the low thrum of interference, now found their receivers overwhelmed by a cacophony that defied tuning. The familiar Morse code signals, once sharp and distinct, blurred into an indistinguishable wash of noise, then vanished entirely. This was not the intermittent, localized jamming they had encountered before. This was a sustained, wide-spectrum assault, emanating from multiple points and converging on their frequencies. The Americans had deployed a new generation of high-power transmitters, their signals amplified and directed with an unprecedented precision. Unit logs from the 352nd Infantry Division, dated June 7, 1944, record the first complete loss of radio contact across an entire battalion sector. For 27 minutes, no message, no confirmation, no order could be transmitted or received. This initial silence was a precursor to a wider, more profound disruption. The jamming transmitters, identified later through captured technical manuals as AN-APT-2 carpet jammers, operated across a frequency range of 85 to 130 MHz, precisely targeting the German Fug-10 and Fug-16 airborne and ground-to-air communication sets. Each AN-APT-2 unit, housed in a modified B-17 bomber, flying racetrack patterns behind the front lines, delivered a continuous output of 500 watts, a significant increase over earlier, less effective ground-based systems. The sheer volume of these jamming aircraft, flying in coordinated formations, created an overlapping field of interference that rendered entire swathes of the battlefield acoustically blind. German radio technicians, frantically adjusting their dials and swapping out crystals, found no respite. The signals simply were not there. Interrogation reports from captured German radio operators consistently describe a growing sense of isolation. "We were cut off," one Gefreiter stated, "completely alone." The breakdown in communication was not just a technical failure, it was a psychological weapon, isolating units and fostering a pervasive sense of vulnerability. By the morning of June 8th, a 40-kilometer stretch of the Normandy front, from Carentan to St. Lo, experienced intermittent but critical radio blackouts, lasting for periods of up to an hour. The 7th Army's command, attempting to coordinate counterattacks against the Allied beachheads, found its directives lost in the ether, its subordinate units unable to report their positions or request vital artillery support. The silence grew. It was not a quiet peace, but a roaring, oppressive void, filled with the static of 1,000 unheard voices. The front, once a network of constant chatter, became a collection of isolated islands, each unit fighting its own battle, disconnected from the larger war. The trickle of dispatches from the Eastern Front, initially dismissed as localized anomalies, began to coalesce into a pattern too stark to ignore by late 1943. Field reports from Army Group Center detailing inexplicable communication failures during critical counterattacks were now being cross-referenced with similar complaints from Army Group North and Army Group South. The sheer geographical spread and synchronized nature of the interference suggested a deliberate, coordinated effort rather than random atmospheric disturbance or isolated equipment malfunction. Interrogation files from captured Soviet radio operators, though often yielding little concrete intelligence, occasionally contained fragments of information regarding specialized jamming units operating behind the front lines. These units, equipped with mobile transmitters, were described as deploying rapidly to disrupt German command frequencies during offensives. While the Soviets had always employed some level of electronic warfare, the scale and sophistication now being reported indicated a significant escalation. a technical analysis of intercepted Allied radio traffic, conducted by the Forschungsanstalt der Deutschen Reichspost in Berlin, revealed an increase in broadband noise transmissions originating from areas directly adjacent to active combat zones. These signals, characterized by their wide frequency spectrum and high power output, were designed not to transmit information, but to overwhelm existing channels. The energy signatures were unlike anything previously encountered on such a scale. Production logs from German radio equipment manufacturers showed no corresponding increase in component failures that could account for the widespread communication breakdowns. The Telefunken and Siemens factories continued to produce their standard complement of few G series transceivers, their quality control reports indicating consistent performance within design parameters. The problem lay not with the German equipment itself, but with the environment in which it was forced to operate. The strategic implication was profound. The Wehrmacht, a fighting force built upon rapid maneuver and centralized command, was being systematically blinded and deafened. Orders from divisional headquarters to regimental commands were delayed by hours, sometimes days, forcing local commanders to make decisions without critical intelligence or coordination. The tactical advantage of surprise and concentrated force was being eroded by an invisible enemy. A directive from the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht in October 1943, circulated to all army groups, formally acknowledged the systematic and large-scale electronic interference by enemy forces. It mandated immediate investigation into countermeasures and alternative communication methods, a tacit admission that the problem had reached a critical threshold. The era of unchallenged radio superiority was undeniably over. Normandy, June 1944. The initial reports from the Panzer Lahr Division, fragmented and delayed, spoke of an unexpected silence, a void where once the reassuring crackle of command had been. Interrogation files from captured Funkers later revealed a profound disorientation, a sense of isolation that permeated the ranks long before the first American tanks were sighted. The psychological toll of this communication vacuum began to manifest in a pervasive uncertainty, eroding the foundational trust in the central command structure. The tactical implications were immediate and severe. Without reliable radio links, the swift coordination essential for armored warfare dissolved. Unit diaries from the 21st Panzer Division detail instances where companies, cut off from battalion headquarters, engaged targets based on outdated intelligence or visual cues alone, often leading to friendly fire incidents or missed opportunities. The precision of blitzkrieg, reliant on synchronized movement and rapid response, became a crude, disjointed advance vulnerable to the Allied air superiority and overwhelming artillery. Operational logs from Army Group B illustrate a stark decline in the efficiency of counterattacks. Orders, when they eventually arrived via dispatch riders or landlines, were hours old, rendering them obsolete against the rapidly shifting front lines. Fuel and ammunition resupply, critical for sustaining mobile operations, became a chaotic affair, with convoys often arriving at empty positions or falling prey to Allied fighter bombers due to a lack of real-time threat intelligence. The strategic consequences rippled through the entire Western Front. The ability of the German High Command to assess the true nature of the Allied bridgehead and to deploy reserves effectively was severely hampered. Intelligence summaries, compiled from disparate and often contradictory reports, painted an incomplete and frequently misleading picture of the invasion's progress. This informational fog contributed directly to critical delays in committing strategic reserves, notably the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, which remained largely unengaged for crucial days. Production figures from the Reich Ministry of Armaments and War Production for the third quarter of 1944 show a marked increase in demand for field telephones and signal cable, a desperate attempt to compensate for the lost radio capacity. This shift in resource allocation documented in procurement manifests, diverted critical materials and manufacturing capacity from other essential war efforts, further straining an already overstretched industrial base. The German military, once a paragon of modern communication, found itself reverting to methods more suited to the First World War, a stark and undeniable regression in the face of a technologically superior foe. The final damage report from Kane, dated July 19, 1944, recorded over 80% of German armored vehicles in the sector as unrecoverable.